Since the beginnings of history, Africa has remained somewhat of an anomaly. Since ancient Rome, the extent of their knowledge of Africa was limited strictly to the borders of the Sahara Desert in Ethiopia. Anything past the near impossible desert was strictly limited to speculation and hearsay, which had given Africa the name the Dark Continent due to its unforgiving terrain and alien natives. But, as the world globalized and the great powers of Europe expanded their colonies, attention was once again paid to Africa. The story today focuses on the most hotly fought-over piece of land on Earth, the land of gold and diamonds, the land of shrubs and sand, the rocky hills of South Africa. In order to understand the story to come, we must first talk about the Dutch. The Dutch were one of the few nations in the late Renaissance which were gifted with the art of colonization. Due to a combination of factors such as their semi-neutral foreign policy, open trade relations, and seafaring nature, and a general innovative prowess, the Dutch princedoms were able to amass an immense measure of wealth and prosperity, which made them a target of envy. Because of this wealth, expeditions were funded throughout the 1600s to the far corners of the world to expand their trade empire. From Aruba in the Caribbean to Suriname to Japan and the Indonesian islands, the language of trade was Dutch, and Dutch products were revered the world over. The first Dutch settlement in South Africa was established in 1652 by Captain Jan van Riebeeck. The settlement was intended strictly as a base of operations for trading ships and goods warehouses. But as the demands for greater international trade swelled, and the population of the Netherlands and Flanders grew, there was an ever-present push to grow the colony into something more akin to the American colonies of Britain and France. The Dutch people were clamoring for a settlement colony, and not just another trade node. The South African Cape Colony was the only outlet, so in 1691, the Dutch East Indian Company declared South Africa ripe for settlement. The movement of people to the Cape Colony was different than the movement of people who went to the Americas. To move to the Cape Colony, you had to meet certain requirements that may seem odd to a modern mindset. The requirements went as follows. One must be of a generally stocky height and physically stout stature, have within them a solid Protestant work ethic, be of good character and never have committed crimes, and must agree to establish farms in the name of the Dutch East India Company. The people selected for these challenges were known as the Vrijburgers, or free citizens, as, for the most part after they left the safety of Van Riebeeck Fortress, the countryside was generally lawless open land. The situation was almost identical to the situation in the American Wild West, but instead of Native Americans, it's Bantu and Khoi tribes harassing the settlers and vice versa. Small farmsteads began to pop up around Van Riebeeck Fortress, and the town quickly became overpopulated and outgrowing its shell. The colony began to become bankrupt due to a lack of exports, so an economic collapse of the Cape Colony in the early 1700s caused a mass exodus away from Cape Town into the vast open country. The people who left the safety of Cape Town became known as Boers, the Dutch word for farmer. All throughout the early and late 1700s, Boer caravans crossed the near infinite sea of rocky hills and hostile natives. 10,000 people crossed through mountain paths and over plains to escape the Cape Town poverty, and to the north they established numerous towns and cities, such as Swellendam and Graaff-Reinet. Tensions were high throughout the Boers' trek, but eventually the Voortrekkers began to settle in the high northeast of South Africa, at a spot now known as the city of Pretoria. The Netherlands, like many other countries in the Napoleonic Wars, was subjected to invasion by France in 1795. The Dutch army stood no chance against the amassed armies of the French war machine, and their small, inexperienced maritime army was forced out of the country along with a legitimate government. In its wake, in the style of the French Revolutionary Council, a puppet government pretending to be a democracy was established in the war-racked Dutch provinces calling itself the Batavian Republic. With the Dutch constitutional monarchy in exile and the Netherlands as a war zone, the Dutch colonies experienced a wave of unrest and invasion. the Dutch Cape Colony became somewhat independent and declared that any hostile act by the British is an act of war. The British, rather amused by this barely functional trade settlement, met their offer. In late 1795, the British Royal Marines invaded the Cape Colony to use South Africa as a gate to cut off French ships from crossing back and forth to and from India. Colonists surrendered after the Battle of Muizenberg, where the British warships shelled various towns and cities along the coastline. In Europe, France organized the Treaty of Amiens in 1802, which ended the War of the Second Coalition. As per the Treaty of Amiens, the puppet Batavian Republic was given easy peace terms, in which they were returned control over South Africa and the Caribbean islands. Obviously, in the instability of the Napoleonic Wars, Britain was again forced into conflict with Batavia, and in the War of the Third Coalition, they were forced to invade the Cape Colony for a second time to reassert naval dominance. Again, in 1806, the British Marines landed outside of Cape Town at the small village of Blauwberg. The Battle of Blauwberg was the largest military engagement thus seen in South Africa, with almost 10,000 men fighting in the warm beachside, with nearly 1,000 of which dying in the sand. The Articles of Batavian surrender at Cape Town was the end of Dutch rule over South Africa, and on the 19th of January 1806, all Batavian soldiers stood down and returned their rifles over to the British. The underpaid Dutch soldiers were more than happy to live than defend this isolated city on the outskirts of the world. On that day, all of South Africa was occupied by Britain, but British soldiers really only occupied Cape Town, while they left the rest of the country to do as it pleases. At the end of the War of the Sixth Coalition, in 1814, all of South Africa became solidified under British rule. It was now officially a British colony. After losing America in the Revolutionary Wars, Britain was pleased to have another place to let some of its population pressure steam off. And in 1818, Britain began large-scale colonization projects in South Africa to rebuild the country after decades of stagnation. Throughout the 1820s and 1830s, thousands of new families immigrated to South Africa for various reasons, but the primary purpose was to change the demographics of South Africa in such a way as to make English the official language of Cape Town, rather than Afrikaans. More and more people moved away from the poverty of Cape Town, putting everything they owned in a cart and traveling east into the open pastures. In 1835, the largest migration of Boers had thus since occurred. The population of Boers was quickly growing as small towns sprouted out of nowhere like flowers in a prairie. Things were good, and aside from the occasional Xhosa tribes, the people lived in isolation in the hills for years. The Xhosa tribes were a serious threat in large numbers, and in 1838, an enormous war party of Xhosa and Zulu warriors attempted to raid a Voortrekker caravan. The battle that ensued at Blood River was a slaughter for the Zulu tribes, as their spears were met by small cannon fire and musketry. 400 Boers faced over 5,000 Zulus, and the Zulus lost almost their entire army, while the Boers only had 3 people injured. The technologically backwards African tribes were completely sent into disarray by gunfire, and they were promptly dispatched by Boer rifles. The battle was so miraculous that many Boers sought this as God himself intervening and blessing their people with divine grace. How blessed the Boers were, we'll soon find out. Peace is a fragile thing, and with peace comes exploration. The discovery of diamonds in Boer territory in 1867 was a blessing and a curse. A blessing in that the Boer farmers began to get rich off of prospecting diamonds, and a curse in that the eyes of the British Empire was turned towards the Boers. For the longest time, the British had been content to just lord over Cape Town, and in the discovery of these rare gems and gold, led to the ever-hungry-for-wealth empire to begin a mass expedition into the northeast to secure the diamonds in the name of Her Majesty. As you can imagine, the Boer locals were rather happy to have their wealth for themselves, so, in 1868, they formally ratified a constitution declaring themselves an autonomous state within the British Empire. Obviously, this was a slap in the face of the British authorities, who took this as an act of rebellion. But, due to the lack of British military forces in the region, the situation was forced into a sort of Cold War scenario, where the Boers were waiting with bated breath for the British to make their move. The Boers had 2 nations which they called their own, the South African Republic, also known as Transvaal, and the Orange Free State to the south of it. The Orange Free State was, for all intents and purposes, a British puppet state, and the only true independent Boer land was north along the Vaal River. In 1877, it happened. The British formally declared the Transvaal state a British protectorate, the first step towards their total annexation. This obviously shook up the Boers, and movements to rid themselves of British administration were growing. Although technically annexed, the Boers were more or less independent still, as the British began building gold and diamond mines. But as taxes and regulations forced upon the Boers became higher and higher, true discontent was boiling over. The First Boer War started in 1880, as a Boer civic engineer named Peter Beisenhout was illegally taxed by British authorities to the point of bankruptcy. The British debt collectors forced him to repay them with his wagon in return for all the money he owed. This illegal act sparked deep hatred and became the catalyst for war. In late 1880, the Boers rose up against their British oppressors and began to seize and arrest all British officials. This sparked Britain to send its South African garrison to put down the rebellion. But, as we learned from the British involvement in Afghanistan, to fight a people in the hills is not such an easy task. The British forces were under constant harassment by Boer snipers and cavalry raids. Supply convoys were burnt and destroyed, and the Boers never gave the enemy a chance to easily fight back. Quickly, Britain realized the bee's nest it had just kicked, and in early 1881, they backed down and accepted peace. The peace treaties were a hot legal battle, but the final agreed treaty was the London Convention of 1884, in which it agreed that the Boers continue to have their own country, but are banned from negotiating with other nations. The banning of Boer diplomacy was Britain's fear that the Boers would ally themselves with Portugal or Germany, an honest worry considering Britain's massive naval races with Germany building up. Tensions were abated, and the Boers digest their victory, for now. As time passed, more and more gold was discovered in the hills and mountains of the Transvaal, and with the gold rush came tens of thousands of foreigners trying to capitalize on the wealth. More and more English settlers moved illegally into Boer lands, much to the dismay of the Boer government. By 1895, the situation was so out of hand that the Boer government ordered a decree saying that all British outlanders must leave or renounce their British citizenship and adapt Boer customs. This obviously wasn't appreciated by the British government, and in retaliation they sent a band of 600 soldiers into Transvaal under the pretense of protecting the new British settlers. This outraged the Boer head of state, Paul Kruger, and in retaliation the Boer army was sent to remove the British army column that had moved into their land. The ensuing firefight killed 65 British men, while the Boers only had one death. This raid by Britain again flared tensions up, and quickly the Boers realized their days were numbered. In 1897, the Boers broke their treaty, and moved into open negotiations with European nations to buy large amounts of weaponry. The purchase of almost 40,000 new rifles and cannons led to the Boers becoming a major threat once again, and was the final nail in the coffin for peace. The machinations of war began to move, and finally, the pretenses of peace were dropped. In 1899, an ultimatum was sent to the British government. The ultimatum was to force the illegal British settlers to leave Transvaal, or else war would be declared between Britain and the Boers of the Orange Free State and Transvaal. Prime Minister of Britain, Neville Chamberlain, responded in kind.
Of course, there can only be one answer to this grotesque challenge. Kruger has asked for war, and war he must have.
And with that declaration, the Transvaal erupted into war, with the Orange Free State declaring independence. The sudden spike in tensions was a shock to the British, which allowed the Boers to go on the offensive. Their first action was recapturing the various mountain ranges that Britain had illegally annexed years earlier, and surrounding the various towns and cities throughout the plains. The city of Ladysmith, Mafeking, and Kimberley were all put under the gun of heavy Boer artillery, and were besieged by all sides by hostile armies with no apparent help from their home country coming to their aid. It was a blow to British prestige to have these barely functional Boer countries suddenly going around and capturing the Empire's cities. Less than 2 weeks into the war, and it already looks like the Boers had won. But in spite of these early losses, the British government strengthened its resolve and ordered the largest assembly of Her Majesty's troops since the Crimea. Almost 200,000 men were sent to root out the Boers and finally put put an end to this over 200-year-long charade. The first major British advance occurred in January of 1900, when General Charles Warren crossed his men over the Colenso River. These were not the first boots to be trotting on Boer soil, and these were not the last. Slowly, day by day, fighting in the style reminiscent of the Mongols, the Boers led their almost entirely cavalry forces throughout the hills and valleys, letting the British tire themselves out chasing them. Although technically on the retreat, the Boers were not giving up a single hill and forest without a fight. More and more land was burnt to the ground to stop the British from resupplying within Boer territory. Wells were poisoned so that thirst racked the English soldiers. Days went by, and with time the British armies were finally able to relieve the cities of Ladysmith and Kimberley. Soon Mafeking would follow. The initial Boer surprise attack had been utterly reversed. Ever so slowly, the British advance got its momentum, and in the early days of March the Boers were in a panicked retreat, as the Orange Free State was being entirely surrounded. The situation was so dire that the Boers themselves began to suffer horribly from thirst and hunger, and the unthinkable had begun to happen throughout the Boer cities. Women and children began to burn down their homes while the men were out fighting, and joined their husbands on the horses and wagons, effectively making the entire Boer population mobile. This was, for all intents and purposes, the end of large-scale fighting. The second phase of the Boer War was much different than the first, as instead of active armies maneuvering, there were guerrilla campaigns and ambushes that caused constant disruption in the region. In order to try and stop the guerrilla raids, a plan was devised to put an end to Boer hostilities once and for all. The plan was to take the women and children who had left their towns and villages, and instead of allowing them to join up with their husbands on the frontiers, they were to be taken to camps and held until the war was over. Concentration camps. The idea of concentration camps wasn't new, as thousands of prisoners in the American Civil War died in so-called war prisons in Georgia at Andersonville concentration camp. For the time, putting people into secluded camps was just part and parcel of anti-guerrilla warfare tactics, as on the other side of the world, the Spanish were putting Cubans into camps. The constant burning of farms destroyed food production in the Transvaal, and by the day the women and children grew thinner and weaker, and disease spread like wildfire. By the end of it, almost 40,000 people died behind a British wire fence. By 1902, the war had just gotten out of hand. The Boer civilization had, for all intents and purposes, been obliterated. The peace conferences were called to try to put an end to the slaughter, but the peace talks droned on and on for months while people died by the thousands. But eventually, on May 31st, 1902, a treaty was signed, and once again the Boers were in the hands of the British. The Treaty of Vereeniging was exactly as you could expect, the total annexation of all Boer nations, and Boer subservience to the Empire. 200,000 people dead, all for some scraps of land with some diamonds. South Africa was occupied for 8 years, as stipulated by the treaty, and the country was given Dominion status in 1910, putting it on the same level as Australia and Canada within the Empire. The 20th century was optimistic for South Africa, as the scars of the Boer Wars were beginning to heal, and real progress was being achieved. The country was industrializing quickly, with railroads and trains bustling across trails and roads that years prior would have been done by horse and buggy. Newfound wealth fueled South Africa into the modern age, but without British intervention subsidizing the country, it would have fallen flat on its face. However, due to the souring of relations of the First World War, South Africa was once again plunged into conflict, this time fighting an enemy abroad rather than internally. The very first action by the South African army was capturing the undefended German colony of Namibia, which was a smashing success, and left only one front open for the South Africans to fight in. The German colony of Tanzania was the jewel of Germany's colonial possessions, and the next target for South African legions. Tanzania was surrounded by the Entente on 3 sides, with the Belgian Congo to the west, Kenya with His Majesty's African Rifles ready to strike to the north, and to the south, the South African legions along with neutral Portuguese Mozambique. Fortunately for the Germans, however, they were led by a tactical genius, General Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck. You see, Due to the lack of resources and manpower, the struggling German colonial authority employed the use of Africans as soldiers, something that the British and South Africans were skeptical of. Using the knowledge of the land from the local Africans, the German East African Army was able to put up fierce resistance throughout the entirety of the First World War. So much so that even after the Armistice Treaty was signed, Lettow Vorbeck refused to believe it and continued his campaigns. The Germans used the jungles as natural coverage and pioneered guerrilla warfare tactics still seen in modern wars such as Vietnam. The ever-elusive Germans put the British on a wild goose chase across the eastern side of Africa to try to subdue Vorbeck and his African army. But eventually, through superior numbers, the joint effort of British, Portuguese, Belgian, and South African forces completely cut Lettow Vorbeck off from the rest of the world, and peace was restored to Africa, for now. South African involvement in the First World War, albeit limited, contributed greatly to the war effort. In the Treaty of Versailles, South Africa was awarded the German colony of Namibia for their sacrifice, and were granted greater autonomy within the British Empire. No longer South Africa was just a dominion, but now a voluntary ally of Britain and an independent country. Again, as tensions ratcheted up with Germany, Britain declared the violation of Poland's neutrality as a case for war. And on the 3rd of September 1939, they declared a state of war between themselves and Germany and its allies. But for South Africa, the situation was different now. The country was no longer dependent on Britain to uphold South Africa's government and industry. And there was serious pushback against British rule within the country. Since Hitler took power in 1933, some of his diplomatic efforts were to try to appeal to the various nations that Britain had wronged in the past, one of which was the Boers of South Africa. In the early years of 1938, movements began to form in areas which were once Boer land. A group, styling themselves in the image of Nazi Germany, called the Assavat-Brandwagen, established a political party, and were quickly becoming popular among the various Dutch-speaking people of South Africa, as they saw solidarity with their cousins in Germany. Because of the radical neutral and fascist elements in South Africa's government, there was debate in the halls of Parliament as to how South Africa was to respond to demands for help. A vote was called, and by a sliver of a percentage, South Africa allied with Britain and declared war on Germany. Obviously, this was an outrage to the Assavat-Brandwagen and the various other extremist groups, and almost immediately unrest grew into open revolt. A terrorist organization that had parallels with the sergeants in Ireland called the Sturmjagers was formed, and their goal was to remove all British involvement in Boer lands. The Sturmjager insurgents blew up railway stations going in and out of diamond mines, cutting off Britain from their wealth. Power lines were sabotaged and cut, and the first action of the South African Army of the Second World War was hunting down the Sturmjager militias in the mountains. By 1943, Sturmjager activity more or less died down. Abroad, the South African Expeditionary Forces were attached to the New Zealand and Australian forces, and were deployed to the Mediterranean theater. The main legacy of the South African forces was their involvement in the Egypt campaign, at the Second Battle of Akh Alamein, which was the first major pushback against Axis forces pretty much since the start of the war. The South African forces chased the Italians out of Ethiopia, and reasserted King Selassie as the monarch of Ethiopia. Wherever British soldiers went, South African divisions followed. But because of the sheer distances required to sustain their army, much of South Africa's war effort was in providing resources such as chrome and gold to the industries of the Allies. Again, as seen in the First World War, South African support was lukewarm at best, but valuable nonetheless. South Africa as a nation, in reality, gained surprisingly little from the Second World War, and one can say that it was actually a major step towards the nation's eventual decline. After the war, South Africa declared itself totally independent from Britain, and adopted an entirely neutral foreign policy similar to Switzerland. As years passed, Paralleling the civil rights movement in the United States, South Africa was continually fevered by racial tensions as more and more black Africans illegally moved into the country. Soon, the entire democratic process was being undermined by massive voter fraud and internal issues. So, in 1948, a constitution was drawn in which total segregation between blacks and whites was made. But, as the Cold War thawed, and the Soviet Union fell in 1991, international attention was once again paid to Africa. Soon the world was witness to the inequality in South Africa, as nations began cutting off all trade deals and strangling South Africa's economy until it was just a husk. The country had a new constitutional convention the same year, and a new constitution was drafted where apartheid ends, and blacks were given equal rights. Racial violence still plagues South Africa. Boer farmers are killed in attacks of revenge by blacks, and blacks are still reviled to live in ghettos. Perhaps South Africa will once again see harmony, but like a diamond, a glimmer of hope is buried deep beneath miles of chaos.